Welcome to this class on the principle of core support. Now, core support means that we need to address what core means, and there are multiple meanings of this. And core and center are two slightly different concepts, and we can first address anatomy, such as the diaphragm, maybe being the moving center between the upper and lower body, or the anterior portion of the spine where the lumbar and thoracic meet. You know, we have this part of the diaphragm in the backspace. And the idea of center is a very kind of mathematical notion of relative proportion and distance, like the center of a circle. And therefore in movement, we can use this idea of center as something simply to organize movement around, and therefore you could have a center anywhere. But for example, we can think about the navel center as being something to initiate from, the belly button, or the space behind the belly button, in between the lower back and the skin of the belly. We can think of that space as the center. Core really requires a sort of extra word, core of. So we can think of the core of the pelvic bones as the organs, or the core of the thorax, you know, being the heart, or the core of the bones themselves being fluid. So this core distal relationship, which gets spoken about in the Bartenieff Fundamental Principles, it might mean navel center to the limbs or to the head or the tail, and that's why radial symmetry is sometimes used also as an idea, because that's a symmetrical idea of center of a circle. And this gives us another way to describe a kind of equal attention from where the core to the distal end, or the edge of this circle, is, as being all the same and all therefore equal. In other developmental pattern classes, we'll speak of 6 limbs radiating from navel center, even though those 6 limbs are of different lengths. Navel center to tailbone is significantly shorter than navel center to the hand. So their core is giving us a point of orientation, but not necessarily of what that means for the things that are connected to it. What else can we say? Distal also means the end of the bone that is furthest from the central axis of the body in anatomy. So the distal end of the femur, the thigh bone, means, you know, the knee, or the fibula and the tibia. So we can think of the distal end as anatomically of the bones, but we can also speak of the distal end of the hand relative to the spine. And proximal means the end of the bone that is nearer the central axis. So the femur, if we stay with the thigh bone, that's into the acetabulum, you know, the hip socket. And in BF classes, you might hear proximal joints being referred to more as the hip sockets and the shoulder sockets, but this is perhaps somewhat misleading, because proximal could also mean, you know, the elbow, or it could mean even just the end of one part of their fingers, you know, like the small bones of the hand. They will also have proximal and distal end. Okay, we're getting away from core, but this is how the principle of core support opens up this more topics around it. But core can also mean something that is not only anatomically experienced, but also a sense of self and what is meaningful to you, your core values, and your ways of being in the world. And in this sense, core is more profoundly existential. So dropping into this sense of diaphragm separating lower and upper, but also integrating a sense of wholeness between upper and lower. Sense of inner connection between these two other cores. Pelvic core, rib cage. And from this movement of diaphragm, feel free to add a little bit more sequencing through to find the limbs. So by sequencing through, I mean this sense of the movement of diaphragm informing maybe a flow through the arms, through the proximal joints of the hips, down into the legs. Taking whatever movement you feel makes sense with this movement of diaphragm. Maybe a little reaching and extending, flexing, compressing. Playing with a relationship of limbs to core, with a sense of the diaphragm somehow initiating or beginning what this movement might be. And it might feel like more like a jellyfish or more undifferentiated, or it might feel like you're exploring one leg and then the other leg as you find it. And seeing what the limb of the skull wants to do in relationship to diaphragm. Feeling a sequencing through spine, maybe. So mobilizing this sense of core through paying attention to diaphragm. And the movement can be as large or as small as you like. So no need to stop what you're doing, but I'm going to shift the image. Rather than a sense of diaphragm, what about imagining more like the sap flowing through a tree, where that sap is drawn from the roots and goes through into every single branch. So the core is now through the whole structure. A sense of the core of the torso, into the core of the arms, through into the core of the hand, into the core of each finger. And what about through into the core of the leg, the upper leg, the lower leg, through into the foot, and the core of each toe? Core of torso moving through the core of the neck into the skull. And when I do this for myself, I imagine that this is like a bright green for some reason. So if a color emerges to you and is helpful, play with it, also having a color. But paying attention to this core of body feeling like it goes through the whole structure. And now skin is more of the outer, and your attention is more to the inner. Making whatever movements you would like to explore this idea of core, and how might that support whatever movement you're doing. So still fairly fluid, whatever tempo works for you, to sense, to keep with this image, to keep reinitiating this ongoing fluidity of central core through your structures. Take one more moment for yourself to explore this image of a central core in whatever colour it might take. And then gently maybe push yourself to sit. And if your eyes aren't open, just shuffle yourself, open your eyes, bring yourself back to your screen, because I'd like to share an image with you that's part of this inspiration of the inner core of the body, just for a bit of poetic shift of attention. There's an Italian artist called Giuseppe Pennon, and he has a practice of hollowing out trees at a very particular ring of the tree. In fact, he does it often by a particular year in order to mark other kinds of topics. But I just want to show you this image in order for you to maybe resonate with your body's structure and this tree on the right side, or at least maybe it's on the left side. But you see, he's taken the whole length of the tree and carved out this ring of the tree. And we can kind of consider this life force of sap and this kind of age of time quite poetically and beautifully from that image, I think. So we will take this image of core and this idea of core through the whole structure into some more familiar, for some of you, BF exercises. Big X, small ball on your side. Big X, small ball on your side. So your limbs are going from fully extended to condensed to extended. Spinal core compressing, also because you're rolling from one side to another side, it might also compress sideways as you condense into a small ball. So those are the body actions. If you haven't done this with me before, big X, small ball, rolling side to side. Play with that, with this image of core mobilization, and with this whole of the core of the limbs into the fingertips. Now, some of you who've done this have done it different ways, and that is exactly what the BF system is, a set of delights to play with in different ways. So have an explore of X's and O's from this sense of core support. And then I'll carry on feeding in some more instructions, but just have a play with that for now. Tapping back into that sensation of the inner structure, the inner flow of your structures. And getting to grips with this body action of folding of limbs, condensing of spine, changing base of support. And it's up to you whether you try and keep your limbs in contact with the ground for as long as possible, or whether you lift them off the earth. You don't have to keep doing it the same way. And if you feel like you're doing it and holding your breath a little bit, see if you can slow it down, pause, reinitiate. There's no one right way to breathe except to keep breathing. And to feel like you're including all of you. So no little part gets left behind. And so your limb to core relationship is both quite mobile. Limbs are moving and the spinal core is moving. Shift it for a moment and just do it with your limbs. Go ahead and do this, rolling to one side and rolling to the other side without moving your spine much. Just folding at the hips and the knees and the ankles and the shoulder girdle. Can you even roll? What happens when this becomes about the limbs only and doesn't include core as a pelvic core or thoracic core? And then go back to including the spine and the skull and the tailbone, rolling your organs. And just notice what you sense in that difference. And occasionally you might roll yourself onto your side, onto your front even. You might explore opening and closing the limbs on a different surface, a different base of support. You might even push yourself to sit a little bit and back down into lying. With this sense of ongoing throughness of this core into fingers, toes, skull. With the sense of the whole of your body involved. The whole of you involved. Okay, and let's roll to one side and up onto all fours. So coming into this kind of place. So maybe you can have a little look. And we'll switch the focus from a mobilizing core to a stabilizing core in order to lift one limb, extend a leg, see where that leg wants to go. Now I just got the warning running out of time because I realized I'd set the meeting to start half an hour early before we actually started. So at some point soon it will time out, but I'll leave you with this stabilizing core, mobilizing limbs, playing with that a little bit, even coming into this kind of shape and seeing what can happen. And then starting to play with mobilizing core a little bit more. So finding more of the movement in this kind of mid-level of space. And occasionally coming back in to check in with stable core, mobile limbs, what does that feel like? Mobile core, what does that feel like? Playing between mobile and stable and mobile. So in somewhere like this on all fours, you can really take the time to go, oh, hello pelvic floor, hello abdominals, sure. I can bring you in, stabilize with you, and then I can do maybe other things. And then I can go, no, I'm going to mobilize my core through action. And not forgetting the skull and tailbone. You might be playing with movements that are more familiar or more unfamiliar. That's fine. And as you're doing this, you may notice which parts are starting to lead you. Whether limbs might initiate, or core, as in pelvic core, might initiate, or whole of spine might initiate, or just the head might start you off. Just a little toe might start you off. You may have lost this image of the whole core through to the fingers, and maybe it's more of a sense of pelvic core, or thoracic core, or the skull core. Exploring this relationship of limbs and spine with a little bit more emphasis on mobility, stability, and level change. different bases of support. Where is in contact with the earth. And if you're feeling like you're creating one long continuous flow and it's becoming a bit dizzying, just take a little pause, breathe, reinitiate. And if you take a pause, reinitiate from a sense of core support, what that means for you in this moment now. It may mean really paying attention to pelvic floor, reinitiating from the pause. And I'd like us to play with that a little bit more. So we just find a singularity of one movement. What do I mean by that? So if I go back to this place, and if I think about engaging my core and making one body action, pausing, connecting to core, making another action, pausing, connecting to core in whatever way that means for you. It could be about pelvic floor, it could be about really the pelvic center, it could be sensing your spine, it could be tapping into the image of the throughness of like the core of the body from that image of the tree. But make it about a singular movement and then pause, reinitiate, move, pause, and make that the phrasing and see what happens. And then at a certain moment, I'll say, you can do more than one action and you can sort of increase the movement. But for now, paying attention to the pause, what is core, mobilize, pause, action. Have a little play with that. It's a good opportunity to notice how your breath is. Whether the pausing means you hold your breath, can you pause and keep free in the breath? And these movements could be very small, or they could be involving more joints. And if you're still in singular actions, feel free to give yourself a few more before you take a pause. But if you're enjoying even just single joint actions, then go ahead and enjoy single joint actions. And you may invite a little more level change or weight shift if you've been in the same orientation for a while. And then if it's comfortable for you, eventually make your way down to lying on your front surface, but take your time getting there. You can take your time through this pausing, moving, pausing, mobilizing journey. Eventually lying on your front, but take your time. And when you're on your front surface, sensing how your body is contacting the earth so that the organs of the front can feel the support of the ground. Make a pillow for your head, make yourself comfy, and take a moment to really sense into the organs of the belly being held so they can maybe release a little bit. Maybe feeling the pressure changing underneath the lungs as well. How the heart is nestled between them with this different pressure on the ground. The weight of the skull. And then gently roll yourself onto your back surface, easily pressing, making your way there, however it's easy to get there. And then maybe just pushing yourself actually just to see a little moment, because I'd like us to explore a little bit more sense of core initiation with some exertion to find a relationship of a limb towards the core, taking more of a central pathway and returning. A limb towards the core, through the core and returning. And we can have the knee also trying to travel towards the opposite arm. And the knee traveling towards the opposite diagonal. Playing around with that, maybe it takes you to sit, maybe it brings you back down again. Maybe that foot tries to travel all the way across, maybe it goes back again. This sense of core to limb to core to bring you to sit. Or if you're doing this in sitting, you can explore bringing the arm in Bringing the arm back out again, bringing one leg in, bringing the other leg in. Finding how the spine is part of this expression, maybe even initiates. Spine shrinks, hand follows. So these, what could be considered diagonal sit-ups with a little bit more spatial reach. If you open your eyes slightly and give yourself somewhere to see, how does that then help this core mobilization? To maybe take some of the pressure and exertion off, bringing limb to core by adding a bit of a spatial reach. And that might be going more side-sidedness, it might be going more diagonal. See what you find as long as you keep breathing. Sense of the whole body participating, even if something is initiating. And so from this exploration of limbs to core with a bit more seated level change, core exertion, start to take it into something that feels a bit more for you and yours again after this instruction of diagonal sit up. What do you want to do next with this? Where do you want to go? And keep following your interests of what feels really fundamentally right to do now. Of what is core to you. How it becomes meaningful in your process. And we'll take a few minutes in this exploration of moving more now what is really core to you. In whatever tempo or dynamics, eyes open or closed. And the movements may be very big, very small, very dynamic in terms of speed or pressure, maybe more gentle, maybe more stable, more mobile. How do you express the you of here and now? So carry on doing what you're doing. And if your eyes are closed, I encourage you to open them. So beginning to become aware a little bit of the outer environment as you continue this dance of the core of you. And you allow some of the information around you to come in, the light perhaps, or where you are relative to the other parts of the room. And as you're moving around, seeing the things around you, you may start to trace a little bit what would be the distance between myself and the chair, and the center between me and the chair, the kind of the center point. But if I keep moving away from the chair, I might start playing with that relative to the table. Where's that center between me and other things in the space? Where is the center point between me and the lamp? How do I carry on doing what I'm doing with a sense of my whole in relationship to the other things around me? Our relative spatial relation and this relative center between us that keeps moving. Great. Taking one more minute of this dance between you and the space you're in this inner to outer relationship of core support. And eventually bringing this to a stillness, maybe again making contact with thoracic, pelvic core, skull, coming into a bit of self-touch again to remind or remember a sense of body surfaces, of contents and containers, of the pelvic core, the rib cage, the skull. And we'll gather together just for a few moments. I'll just chat through a little bit of what we did. And you're welcome to ask any questions or share if you'd like to share anything. So for those of you who have experience with the Laban and Bartenieff Movement System, you probably saw what I was exploring in terms of filtering the idea of core support through these themes of the kind of dualities of the system of inner, outer, mobile, stable, function, expression, exertion, recuperation. So I can say that again a bit more slowly. We started with more inner sensing of this kind of containers sense of the inner contents, differentiating parts and whole, finding a few different images for core at an anatomical level, but also at a kind of imagistic level. And then shifting a little bit to a limb core relationship of stability and mobility, of mobilizing through core or stabilizing core, mobilizing into limbs, stabilizing limbs. Then shifting a little bit into functionality of like the idea of core preparation for movement, finding a bit more stillness, employing a sense of phrasing to have perhaps a greater sense of stability and sort of strength in movement. And then towards recuperation of feeling a sense of like how the organs could be resting on the earth, being held by the earth. Shifting into a little bit more of this expressive notion of core, of wholeness, of your own impulse of what feels absolutely core to you in the moving and dancing that you just did. And then coming to a bit more of an outer relationship of inner to outer of core in the space that you're in, with that idea of center being a kind of relative spatial notion. It's quite a mathematical idea of the center of a circle, or the kind of center of a donut, you know, like me and the objects around me. I can measure that, I can logically have that concept and then play from there. So that's where we went with this exploration of core support as a principle of the Bartenieff Fundamentals work, which is part of the Laban Bartenieff Movement System. And I would love to hear any questions or comments that you might have.